A decorated soldier boards a flight, ready to head home after months of service. But when he tries to take his seat in first class, the flight attendant stops him cold. What happens next will shock you, and it changes everything for the airline and its passengers. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Sergeant James Carter had just wrapped up a long and grueling 9-month deployment overseas. After months of serving his country, he was looking forward to a well-earned break, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful flight home. It wasn't his first time flying, but this trip felt different. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, but there was a sense of relief as he stepped into the airport terminal, ready to board his flight. He was in uniform, his military ID hanging from his neck, and his first-class ticket was a privilege offered to him as part of the airline's military appreciation program. James had always been treated with respect when traveling in the past. The airline staff usually acknowledged his service with a smile, maybe even a polite thank you. It was a small gesture, but one that made all the difference after months spent in a foreign land. As he approached the gate, the boarding process was smooth, and he quickly made his way down the jet bridge toward the plane. He was eager to settle into his seat, relax, and finally catch up on sleep. First class was where he was headed. He had been upgraded as a part of the military benefits offered by the airline, and he was grateful for it. When he entered the plane, the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s, stood near the entrance, greeting passengers with a forced smile. James greeted her back politely, and she asked to see his boarding pass. No problem, he thought as he handed it over. She took a quick glance at it, nodded, and gestured for him to move toward the front of the plane. It wasn't a long walk, but it felt a little longer as he made his way past rows of seats, knowing that comfort and rest awaited him. However, things were about to take a turn that he didn't expect. As he reached his assigned seat in first class, the attendant's tone shifted. She looked at him for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat is not available for you." James was taken aback. He stared at her for a moment, unsure of what he had just heard. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice low but firm. The flight attendant repeated herself. "This seat is not available for you." She didn't offer any further explanation, just a cold, dismissive look. James glanced around the cabin. First class was practically empty. There were plenty of empty seats. "I have a first-class ticket," he said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm in the military program. I was upgraded." But the flight attendant didn't seem to care. She just shook her head. "I don't care about that. I have to ask you to move to your assigned seat in the back." James felt a mix of confusion and frustration building inside him. This wasn't supposed to be happening. His first-class ticket was supposed to be honored. He had served his country, he had earned this, and yet here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. Something wasn't right. He tried to stay calm. "Can you please check with the manager?" he asked, his voice now firmer, though still controlled. The flight attendant didn't hesitate. "No," she snapped. "Just take a seat in the back." James's heart sank. He had dealt with some rude people in his life, but this felt different. He was a soldier in full uniform, and this woman was telling him to go sit in the back of the plane, even though he had been upgraded. He couldn't understand it. His frustration was building, but he decided not to escalate the situation just yet. He turned to walk back to the coach section, but then he stopped. He looked back at the empty first-class seats and knew he couldn't let this go. He turned around and approached the attendant again, asking once more to speak with the manager. But her response was cold, and her tone made it clear she wasn't going to budge. James couldn't understand what had gone wrong. He was being respectful, but this woman's actions felt deeply wrong, and something in him told him he had to stand up for himself. As the seconds ticked by, he realized he wasn't going to get anywhere unless someone in authority stepped in. And that's when the situation began to spiral out of control. James took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. There was a bitter taste in the air. Something about the flight attendant's tone, her dismissive attitude, and the way she was treating him didn't sit right. He had been in countless airports, sat in many first-class seats, but never had he felt more out of place. Not because of his uniform, but because of the clear disregard for his status as a customer, someone who had earned this privilege. He turned and began walking toward the back of the plane, but the feeling of injustice gnawed at him. He could already feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some watching curiously, others uncomfortably. Most were either too polite or too intimidated to speak up. The flight attendant was still standing by the front, arms crossed, her eyes following him as he moved past the first-class seats. She didn't even offer an apology or a second glance. She just stood there, as if he were the one who was in the wrong. James made his way to the back of the plane, his mind racing. He sat down in his assigned seat in the economy class, but he couldn't focus on anything. The anger and confusion mixed with a sense of humiliation he hadn't expected. It was just a seat, yes, but it was about respect. His entire career had been about earning respect both for himself and his country. And right now, this woman was treating him as if he didn't matter. He felt a heavy weight on his chest. The flight attendants began their routine, going up and down the aisles, but James could barely focus on anything else. The injustice of the situation kept replaying in his mind. How could she have done that? Why had she refused to let him sit in the first-class seat he was entitled to? It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way he was being treated. He had no idea what was going through her mind, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let this slide. So with a deep breath and a sense of resolve building in him, he stood up. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let this woman walk all over him and walk away with a smile, like nothing happened. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to be treated fairly. He had been patient, but now he needed to stand up for himself. He moved quickly to the front of the plane, his eyes searching for the manager. This time he wasn't going to ask. He was going to demand a resolution. When he reached the front, the flight attendant gave him a hard look but said nothing. Instead, she turned away, continuing her work as if he weren't there. James looked around, but there was no sign of the manager. He waited, his heart pounding. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. The tension in the air was palpable. What was going to happen next? Was anyone going to take his side? Or would this woman get away with her actions? And then, just as he began to lose hope, the door at the front of the plane opened, and the manager stepped in. The airline manager, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed uniform and a calm demeanor, stepped onto the plane. James felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone with authority. The flight attendant, still standing near the front, quickly approached him. She spoke to him in a low, hurried tone, but James couldn't make out her words. Whatever she was saying, it didn't matter. He wasn't going to let this go without getting a fair resolution. The manager nodded as the flight attendant pointed toward James, then turned to look at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, James saw nothing but professionalism in the manager's gaze. He thought maybe, just maybe, this would be resolved. But then he saw the faint flicker of something else in the manager's eyes, something that seemed to suggest he might be siding with the flight attendant. "Is there a problem here, sir?" the manager asked, his tone polite but with a hint of distance. James took a steadying breath before responding. "Yes, there is. This flight attendant refused to let me sit in the first-class seat that I've been upgraded to. I've got a valid first-class ticket, part of the military appreciation program. She told me that seat wasn't available, and when I tried to explain, she insisted I sit in the back." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. He wasn't going to back down. The manager glanced over at the flight attendant, who was still standing stiffly, her arms crossed. She wasn't speaking now, but her posture alone spoke volumes. The manager's face didn't change, but James could see the gears turning in his head. There was a slight shift in his expression, a moment of hesitation. For a second, James wondered if he was going to get the help he needed, or if this would become even more frustrating. After a long silence, the manager turned his attention back to James. "I see. Let me check on that for you." His voice was smooth, but there was a coldness to it now. The way he said it made James feel like he was the one causing trouble, as if he were being unreasonable for expecting a first-class seat. James could sense that the manager wasn't exactly rushing to fix the situation. "Thank you," James said, keeping his voice steady, but his patience was thinning. He watched as the manager walked toward the cockpit area, no longer in sight. The flight attendant, still standing near the front, gave James an unreadable look. It was as if she was waiting for something, her arms crossed tightly, her stance rigid. There was something unsettling about her, but James wasn't going to let her intimidation get to him. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. James sat back in his seat trying to calm his thoughts. The minutes stretched on, but no one returned. He glanced around at the other passengers, some of whom were watching the interaction intently. A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one spoke up. It seemed like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the manager return with an apology? Or would James be forced to sit quietly in the back, as if nothing had happened? Just as he was starting to lose his patience completely, the manager returned. He walked briskly down the aisle, his expression now more serious, more focused. This time, he wasn't alone. The airline's chief supervisor, a woman in a sharp suit, was walking behind him. She seemed to be there for backup. This wasn't just an ordinary situation anymore. Something was clearly being taken more seriously now. James straightened up in his seat, bracing for what would come next. The tension was thick, but he had made it clear that he wouldn't settle for anything less than the respect he deserved. The manager and the supervisor approached James, and for the first time the weight of the situation seemed to fully settle in. The supervisor's sharp eyes scanned the area, quickly taking in the scene. James could tell she wasn't pleased. She seemed like someone who valued efficiency, but also someone who understood the importance of handling situations properly. "Sergeant Carter, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience," the manager began, his voice now lacking the coldness from before. But there was something strange in his tone. It wasn't exactly apologetic, just a formal acknowledgement of the issue. "I've spoken with our flight attendant, and I believe there's been a misunderstanding." James didn't buy it. The words felt rehearsed, like something he had heard before when companies tried to cover their tracks. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice calm but heavy with frustration. "How is it a misunderstanding when she refused to let me sit in a seat I'm entitled to? I've got my military ID and a first-class ticket. I don't understand what's unclear about that." The manager shifted his weight slightly, a small sign of discomfort. He didn't immediately respond. The supervisor, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Sergeant Carter, let me assure you that we take these matters seriously. We have policies in place to ensure all of our passengers are treated with respect, regardless of their background or status." Her voice was firm, authoritative, and it gave James a glimmer of hope. She didn't sound like someone who would tolerate unfair treatment. However, the supervisor's next words took James by surprise. "Unfortunately, we do not have a specific military program that guarantees first-class upgrades across the board. What you were told earlier might have been a miscommunication." James stared at her, his frustration reaching a boiling point. "Miscommunication? Are you telling me that I'm just supposed to accept that I was lied to? I've flown with this airline multiple times before. I've been upgraded before. And this isn't about a program. It's about basic respect." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anger threatening to boil over. The supervisor's expression didn't change, but the manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for this level of confrontation. "Sir," the manager interjected, "we're doing our best to resolve the issue. I've looked into your ticket, and I can confirm that your upgrade was indeed legitimate. However, I think there was a mix-up with the seat assignment." He paused, glancing back at the attendant who was still standing by the front, now with her arms tightly folded across her chest, looking more defensive than ever. "The seat was available, but there was some confusion in our system." James didn't believe that for a second. The seat was empty. The flight was far from full, and if there had been a legitimate issue, someone should have explained it to him clearly from the start, not dismiss him so rudely. He felt like he was being blamed for the airline's mistake, and it made him angry. He wasn't just being told to sit in the back of the plane anymore, he was being gaslighted. Before he could respond, the supervisor spoke again, this time with a slight shift in her tone. "I understand your frustration, Sergeant, and I do apologize for how this has been handled. However, this situation needs to be addressed in the proper way." Her eyes flicked toward the flight attendant, who was now standing a few paces away, watching the exchange intently. "We will review her actions and take appropriate steps." The air grew heavy as James processed what she said. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. This was about a flight attendant who had treated him unfairly, someone who had failed to do her job properly. The airline had failed to manage the situation from the start, and now they were trying to spin it into something less than it was. He couldn't help but wonder if they would actually hold her accountable, or if this would all just blow over. The silence hung in the air as James waited, watching the flight attendant from the corner of his eye. She still hadn't spoken, but her body language told him everything he needed to know. She was tense, defensive, and clearly uncomfortable. The question was, would she be allowed to get away with it, or would someone take action? Then, as if on cue, the supervisor turned to the manager and said something in a low voice. The manager nodded in response, and for a moment the conversation seemed to shift. James could feel something changing in the air. The supervisor walked toward the flight attendant, and that's when things took a sudden, unexpected turn. The supervisor approached the flight attendant, who was still standing near the front, her arms tightly crossed, eyes fixed on the ground. She hadn't spoken since the manager's arrival, but now, as the supervisor reached her, the tension in the air thickened. The manager stood a few paces behind them, watching the interaction closely, as if he were waiting for something to happen. James couldn't hear their conversation, but the flight attendant's posture stiffened even further. Her hands, which had been nervously fiddling with the hem of her uniform, were now tightly clenched. She seemed to shrink under the supervisor's gaze, which only made James more suspicious. The supervisor said something, her voice calm but firm. Whatever it was, it seemed to hit a nerve. The flight attendant's expression shifted slightly. There was a flash of anger in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. The supervisor turned toward James and gave him a brief, tight-lipped smile. "Sergeant, we've spoken with our flight attendant, and we've addressed the situation internally. We will be reviewing this matter further after the flight." Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying edge to it, as if she knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't satisfied with just a review. That was the corporate way of sweeping things under the rug. He had already spent enough time trying to explain himself. He had already been told he was wrong, without anyone even listening to his side. But there was something different now. The supervisor wasn't brushing him off anymore. She had acknowledged the issue, and the flight attendant's nervous energy wasn't lost on him. Still, he didn't let his guard down. "What do you mean by review? Are you going to just let her get away with this?" James asked, his voice sharp now. He wasn't going to be placated with a vague response. He wanted answers. The manager, who had been standing silently behind the supervisor, stepped forward. "Sergeant, I assure you that this will be taken seriously. We'll be looking into the actions of the flight attendant, and I will personally ensure that proper steps are taken." His tone was measured, but James could hear the faint hint of unease creeping in. James stared at him, still unconvinced. And what happens to her? She just gets to go back to her job after causing all this trouble? The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the supervisor cut him off. "No, Sergeant, we take these matters seriously. We will be reviewing her conduct, and if the investigation finds that her actions were out of line, there will be consequences." Her words were more direct, as if she was finally taking control of the situation. James's eyes narrowed. There it was. The first acknowledgement that the flight attendant's actions might have been more than just a mistake. The supervisor's response made it clear that something was being done behind the scenes. But what did that really mean? What consequences would she face? Would it be enough to make up for the way he was treated? He didn't know yet, but for the first time he felt like the situation was starting to move in the right direction. The flight attendant, still standing off to the side, wasn't saying anything. She hadn't apologized, and she wasn't going to. Her silence spoke volumes. James couldn't help but wonder if she even realized how serious the situation had become. Her lack of accountability, her refusal to admit her mistake, had now escalated into something far worse than an awkward encounter. The supervisor's words had made it clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a failure of professionalism, and it had consequences. "Sergeant, I understand your frustration," the supervisor continued. "We're going to make sure that this situation is handled appropriately. Thank you for your patience." James stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't feeling victorious, not yet, but there was a shift in the air. Something was finally being done. The flight attendant's actions had been called out, and she wasn't getting away with it. But just as he was about to respond, the supervisor's tone became more serious, almost cold. "However," she added, looking at him sharply, "this situation is still under review, and until we complete that review, I can't provide any further details." James clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to leave things unresolved. "I'll be expecting an update," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't over." The supervisor gave a quick nod, but James could tell she wasn't going to make any promises. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would be fixed immediately. But at least for now, it seemed like someone was finally taking responsibility. As the conversation came to a close, James felt a mix of emotions: relief that something was being done, but also a lingering sense of anger that it had taken so long to get here. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The situation was still brewing beneath the surface, and James had the distinct feeling that it was about to explode in a way no one expected. As the supervisor turned away, signaling the end of their conversation, James couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't fully settled. There was still too much uncertainty hanging in the air. The flight attendant, still standing by the front of the cabin, hadn't once looked him in the eye. Her silence spoke volumes. To him, it felt like she was either too proud to apologize or too unwilling to admit any wrongdoing. Either way, her behavior had set this whole situation in motion, and James couldn't just let it go without a clear resolution. As the minutes passed, the tension on the plane remained thick, but the flight continued on as if nothing had happened. James returned to his seat, his thoughts racing. The stewardess came by with drinks a little while later, but she didn't make eye contact with him. She kept her distance, almost as if she were afraid to interact with him any further. The unease was palpable. James leaned back in his seat, trying to relax, but every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts snapped back to the way he had been treated. He knew it wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about respect, something he'd earned through years of service, something that had been denied to him for no reason. That's what hurt the most. He had been the one to approach the flight attendant politely, to try to explain the situation calmly, yet it was he who had been dismissed and disrespected. He couldn't help but replay the confrontation in his mind. The way she had looked at him when he first approached the seat, the dismissive tone, the way she had insisted, without even checking, that the seat wasn't available. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a blatant refusal to treat him with the respect he deserved, a refusal to even listen to his explanation, and that was something he wouldn't just forget. A few more minutes passed, but no one came to check on him. No one apologized, not even a simple acknowledgement of the discomfort he'd endured. The flight attendants went about their duties, moving around the cabin, but the sense of tension remained. It was as if everyone was just pretending everything was normal, hoping the incident would blow over. James glanced toward the front of the cabin again. He could see the flight attendant, standing by the galley, talking to another crew member. She looked relaxed now, like she had returned to her usual duties, but there was something about the way she held herself that seemed off. There was no hint of remorse, No recognition that she had crossed a line. James had seen enough in his career to know when things were being swept under the rug. This felt like one of those situations. The airline wanted to resolve it quickly, move past it, and hope the passengers would forget about it. But he couldn't. Not this time. He waited a little longer, but the flight didn't seem to be slowing down in any way. The smooth hum of the engines and the occasional chatter from the other passengers made the whole experience feel like a distant memory. But inside, James couldn't let go. His mind was still on the exchange, the way he had been dismissed, the way the flight attendant had humiliated him in front of everyone. He couldn't just sit there and hope for the best. He needed answers. It wasn't until the plane began its descent that things finally took another turn. The seatbelt sign came on, and the cabin lights dimmed, signaling that they were nearing their destination. At that moment, the flight attendant approached his seat. This time there was no eye contact at all. She just stood there silently, waiting for James to fasten his seatbelt. Her presence was uncomfortable, awkward, but there was something else now too, a subtle shift in her posture. The confidence that she had earlier in the flight seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet, nervous energy. James stared at her for a moment, considering whether or not to speak. There were so many things he could say, but he wasn't sure if it would make a difference. Instead, he simply nodded and complied, strapping himself in. But as she moved on to the next row, he couldn't help but wonder, what was going to happen now? The plane touched down without incident, but the tension in the cabin lingered as passengers began to gather their belongings. James stood up, gathering his things, his eyes still on the flight attendant. She was busy helping passengers retrieve their bags from the overhead bins. But there was no attempt at eye contact, no acknowledgement of the interaction they had just shared. It was as if it hadn't even happened, as if the whole thing had just been a blip on the radar for her. But for James, it was far from over. As the plane came to a complete stop, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, James stood in the aisle waiting for the doors to open. The flight attendants began to prepare for disembarkation, and as James moved toward the exit, he saw the supervisor standing by the gate, talking with another crew member. The supervisor's eyes met his as he walked toward the door, and for the first time that day, James felt a flicker of something that might resemble accountability. But was it enough? Would the airline take real action, or would this just be another forgotten incident, swept under the rug by the powers that be? The only thing James knew for sure was that this wasn't the last time anyone would hear about what happened. The wheels of justice, slow as they might be, were finally beginning to turn. But how far would they go? Only time would tell. As James stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, the weight of the situation still lingered. He moved through the crowd of passengers, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the ordeal was over, for now at least, but frustration because he knew something had to be done. This couldn't just be brushed aside like so many other situations he'd seen in his career. The mistreatment, the lack of accountability, it wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let it go. He didn't know what would happen next. The supervisor had said they would review the flight attendant's actions, but he had heard corporate speak like that before. Promises to review and investigate usually meant the issue would get buried, and everyone would move on with their lives. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at stake here. It wasn't just about a first-class seat. It was about the principle of respect. And that principle had been violated in a way that wasn't going to disappear just because the flight had landed safely. James made his way to baggage claim, where he grabbed his bag off the conveyor belt and then paused, staring at the crowd moving around him. He couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been treated this way, in ways big or small, that they had just let slide. The flight attendant's behavior hadn't been a fluke. It had been deliberate, and worse, it had been a sign of something deeper, an attitude that too many people in positions of power had when dealing with others, especially people like him, people in uniform, people who served their country. But James wasn't going to be silent about this. He couldn't be. He was no longer just the soldier on the flight. He was someone who had seen the system fail time and time again, and he wasn't about to let this be just another one of those cases. As he left the terminal and stepped out into the crisp air, he pulled out his phone. The first thing he did was look up the airline's customer service number. If he was going to get any real answers, it was up to him to make sure they were held accountable. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew he had to follow through. Before he dialed the number, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an email, and the subject line caught his attention immediately. Important update regarding your recent experience with airline name. It was from the airline, and although he had no idea what it might say, he opened it curious. The email started with a generic apology, the kind that companies always send when there's a complaint. We regret that your recent experience with airline name did not meet our standards of service. But then it got more specific. The email mentioned the incident on his flight and stated that they had taken immediate action to address the situation internally. There was also a brief mention of an ongoing investigation, but what stood out was the final line. As a result of this incident, the flight attendant involved has been suspended pending further review. James stopped for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen. Suspended? That was a start. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't the kind of resolution he had hoped for, but it was something. Acknowledgement. He had never expected immediate answers, but seeing that the airline had taken some action made him feel like there was still a chance for something real to come of this. He sat down on a nearby bench, processing the email. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was a step. He couldn't let his guard down just yet, though. The email mentioned that the investigation was still ongoing, which meant the flight attendant's suspension was temporary. James knew the company could always choose to quietly reinstate her if they decided the matter wasn't as serious as it seemed, but he wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. He took a deep breath and made the call to customer service. As he was put on hold, he reviewed everything in his mind. The flight, the confrontation, the manager's promises, and the supervisor's words. He wasn't sure where this call would lead, but he knew it was important. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about holding the airline accountable for how they handled the situation and making sure that no one else would go through what he had. When someone finally answered the phone, James began calmly explaining his experience, making sure to stick to the facts. He spoke about how he had been treated, how the flight attendant had refused to let him sit in his seat despite his valid first-class ticket, and how the airline had mishandled the situation from the very beginning. The customer service representative listened without interruption, and when James finished, there was a long pause on the other end. "I apologize, sir," the representative said, his voice sincere. "We take these matters very seriously, and I'll make sure this is escalated to the right team." James couldn't shake the feeling that it was just another standard response, but at least this person wasn't trying to shut him down. He repeated the importance of holding the flight attendant accountable, of making sure that the company followed through on their promises. The representative assured him they would do just that. As the call ended, James sat back, his mind still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wheels were in motion, but he knew the real work was just beginning. The airline's response was just the start, and he wasn't going to rest until he saw it through. For the first time since the incident, James felt a sense of control. This wasn't a fight he was going to lose. This wasn't a situation that could just be swept under the rug. He had been disrespected, but he was determined to make sure that disrespect was recognized and addressed. The truth was, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. And this time, it wasn't going to be forgotten. The next few days were a blur for James. The initial shock of the incident had worn off, but the frustration lingered, simmering beneath the surface. He had done everything he could to push the airline for answers, but now he was in a holding pattern, just waiting to see what would happen next. Every time his phone rang, he picked it up quickly, hoping it was an update on the situation. But all he got were automated emails, customer service responses, and the occasional vague assurance that the investigation was still ongoing. He had no idea how long the process would take. It could be days, weeks, or even months before he got any real closure. But one thing was certain. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic issue. The flight attendant's behavior, her blatant disregard for his status as a service member, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something deeper, something ingrained in the way the airline operated. James knew this wasn't just about him. He wasn't the only one who had ever been mistreated. He wasn't the only one who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated unfairly because of his uniform. There were other soldiers, other people who had traveled with the airline, who might have been subjected to similar treatment. They just hadn't said anything. He knew that, and it drove him to keep pushing for justice, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated the same way. A week later, James received another email from the airline, and this time it was different. The subject line read, "Final update, resolution of your recent incident." James hesitated for a moment before opening it. His heart pounded as he clicked on the message. The email started with another apology, but this time, it was more specific. It explained that after a thorough review of the flight attendant's actions, the airline had decided to terminate her employment, effective immediately. The email also included a detailed breakdown of the investigation process, stating that interviews had been conducted with multiple passengers and crew members who had witnessed the incident. The airline assured James that they had taken the matter seriously, and that they would continue to prioritize customer service and respect for all passengers moving forward. James felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Part of him was relieved. Finally, the airline had done something decisive. The flight attendant would no longer be able to treat anyone the way she had treated him. But another part of him felt uneasy. The situation had escalated so quickly, and the consequences were severe. A job lost, a reputation tarnished, all because of a single interaction. James didn't want anyone to lose their livelihood, but he also knew that her actions had crossed a line. There was no going back from that. Still, the resolution felt like a victory, even if it came at a high cost. James had fought for respect, and in the end, he had gotten it. But more than that, he had forced the airline to confront its own flaws. They could no longer hide behind corporate language and empty promises. They had been forced to make a tough decision, and that was something he could live with. A few days later, he received a personal call from the airline's customer relations manager. It was the first time someone from the company had reached out to him directly. The manager thanked him for his patience throughout the process and reiterated that the company was committed to providing a better experience for its passengers. He also offered James a complimentary round-trip flight as a gesture of goodwill. James wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't interested in free flights. What he really wanted was accountability, and in some way he had gotten that. The manager spoke with sincerity, and for the first time, James felt like the airline was genuinely trying to make things right. He appreciated the gesture, but it wasn't the flight that mattered. What mattered was that the airline had finally done the right thing. As the call ended, James put down his phone and sat in silence for a moment. It had been a long journey, from the moment he had stepped onto that plane, to the anger and frustration he had felt, to the eventual resolution that had come after so much waiting and persistence. It had taken a lot out of him, but in the end, he knew he had made a difference. He had stood up for himself and for the many others who might never have spoken out. James looked out the window, watching as the sun began to set. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, but he knew that things had changed, not just for him, but for the airline, for the flight attendant, and for anyone who might face disrespect in the future. The fight wasn't over, but it was a step forward, and that, to him, was enough for now. As the days went by, James couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized that the fight had become about something much bigger, about standing up for respect, accountability, and the idea that people in positions of authority should treat others with dignity, regardless of their rank, appearance, or background. It had been hard to stay patient during those long days of waiting. The back-and-forth emails, the vague assurances from customer service, it all felt like a corporate shell game, meant to keep him distracted while they moved on to the next issue. And there were moments when he doubted whether the airline would really follow through on their promises. After all, they could easily ignore him and pretend like the situation never happened. He had seen that happen too many times before, where businesses put up a facade of caring, but ultimately did nothing to address the real issues. But then came that final email, the one that confirmed the flight attendant's termination. It was hard to reconcile the fact that someone had lost their job because of an interaction that had started out as a simple misunderstanding. James didn't feel good about it, but at the same time, he knew there was no other option. The flight attendant had failed to do her job and had treated him in a way that was completely unacceptable. No amount of corporate doublespeak could erase that. The termination didn't just represent a victory for James. It was a sign that the airline had been forced to face the ugly reality of how some of its employees behaved. The company had no choice but to hold someone accountable, and that was a win in itself. Still, a part of him felt uneasy. People's lives weren't supposed to be tossed aside so quickly. It made him wonder how many other flight attendants or staff members had made similar mistakes. How many times passengers like him had been treated poorly in small, seemingly insignificant ways that no one ever noticed. The phone call from the airline's customer relations manager had been a nice touch, but it didn't change the fact that something had gone terribly wrong in the first place. The manager had offered his apologies, and while they seemed genuine, James couldn't help but feel that they were also motivated by a desire to close the case quickly and move on. Offering him a free round-trip flight seemed like an attempt to smooth things over, but James didn't want freebies. He wanted respect. He didn't want to be a token gesture or an afterthought. He had been treated unfairly, and the price of that wasn't something that could be erased by a flight voucher. But he couldn't deny that, in a strange way, the process had opened his eyes to the importance of standing up for oneself. Before this, James had always been a quiet, reserved person, content to go about his business without making waves. He had always kept his head down, focusing on his work, his service, and his duties. But now he realized that silence wasn't always the answer. Sometimes you had to speak up. Sometimes you had to make noise. He had learned that the hard way, but in doing so, he had forced change, not just for himself, but for others who might face the same situation in the future. Even after the termination, even after the apology, James knew the story wasn't over. There were still questions left unanswered. The airline had taken action, yes, but how would they ensure that something like this wouldn't happen again? Was it just one bad apple? Or was there a deeper issue within the company's culture that allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place? James didn't have all the answers, but he knew that this wasn't a situation he could simply forget. It wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about pushing for change, making sure that the airline, and perhaps others in the industry, took a hard look at how they treated their customers, especially those who served in the military. He thought about the other passengers on that flight. Had any of them noticed what happened? Had they seen the flight attendant's refusal to let him sit in the first-class seat, the way she had treated him with such disdain? He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him. It wasn't the kind of thing that usually drew attention, especially on a crowded flight. But he realized that even though he had felt alone in that moment, he wasn't. There were countless others who had probably been in similar situations, feeling overlooked or disrespected. Maybe they hadn't said anything, maybe they hadn't made a big deal out of it, but that didn't mean they hadn't noticed. James knew that when people were silent, it didn't mean they didn't care. It just meant they were waiting for someone else to speak up, and that was where he came in. By standing up for himself, he had given others permission to do the same. He didn't know how this story would end, but he had started a conversation, and that was the first step in changing the culture, both at the airline and beyond. In the weeks that followed, he continued to follow up with the airline, ensuring they kept their word and implemented the changes they promised. He made it clear that he wasn't going away until he saw the full picture. He wasn't just another disgruntled passenger who wanted a quick fix. He wanted accountability. He wanted change. Every time he reached out, he was met with more assurances that the airline was working on it. But James wasn't about to let them off the hook. He was patient, but persistent, and he would continue to be until he saw results. It wasn't just about the flight attendant anymore. It was about making sure that people like him, people who had earned their place, would never have to experience that kind of disrespect again. Whether it was the airline or the world at large, James knew that his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of what had happened began to settle deeper into James's mind. The situation with the flight attendant, the uncomfortable confrontation, the series of emails and phone calls, it all felt like a distant memory at times, but in other ways, it was still very much alive. It wasn't just the resolution he had sought. It was the process itself that had become the turning point for him. He had expected some closure, a quiet apology, a standard response. But what he had gotten was something far more impactful, an experience that would change how he saw himself and how he approached the world. James hadn't been a vocal person. Throughout his military career, he had been someone who preferred to handle things on his own, quietly and professionally. If there was a problem, he dealt with it, and if it wasn't something he could fix, he moved on. But the incident on that flight had pushed him into unfamiliar territory. It had forced him to speak up, to fight for something bigger than just his seat on the plane. It was about his dignity, his service, and, ultimately, the respect he deserved. Not just as a soldier, but as a person. The airline had been cooperative to some extent, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were only doing the bare minimum to resolve the issue. Yes, the flight attendant had been fired, and yes, the airline had promised to do better in the future. But James wasn't interested in corporate reassurances or empty promises. He had seen how easily companies could spin a situation, make a quick fix, and then move on without changing anything of real substance. He wasn't going to let them get away with that. Not this time. So, he kept pushing. He sent follow-up emails, asking for more details on the investigation, pressing for information on what steps the airline was taking to ensure such incidents didn't happen again. He asked about their training processes for employees, about how they handled complaints, about how they intended to foster a culture of respect for all passengers, especially those who served in the military. He was relentless, but in a way he knew that if he didn't keep the pressure on, nothing would change. And then, one day, out of the blue, he got a call. It was from the customer relations manager again, but this time the tone of the conversation was different. The manager was no longer offering vague reassurances. This time he was speaking to James as if they were equals, as if they were both partners in a conversation about real change. "Sergeant Carter," the manager said, "we've been listening to your feedback, and I want to thank you for your persistence. We've reviewed our internal procedures, and I'm happy to inform you that we've decided to implement a company-wide training initiative focused on diversity, respect, and military appreciation." James was taken aback. He had expected the usual corporate jargon, but this was different. The company was not just apologizing, they were taking concrete action. The manager explained that following the incident, the airline had conducted a full review of its staff training programs, particularly in how employees interacted with military personnel. They were planning to roll out new training for all flight attendants and customer service staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity, understanding the unique needs of military members, and fostering a greater sense of respect and professionalism in all interactions. James felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. He had pushed for change, and now it was happening. It wasn't just about the flight attendant anymore. It was about making sure that every soldier, every person who had served their country, would be treated with the respect they deserved, not just by this airline, but by others as well. The manager continued, telling James that the airline was also establishing a direct line for military personnel to report any incidents or concerns they faced during their travels. They were creating a system where soldiers, veterans, and their families could speak up without fear of being ignored or brushed off. It was a small step, but James could feel the weight of it. This wasn't a token gesture. It was a real attempt to make things right. For the first time, James felt like he was being heard. The phone call ended with an invitation for James to meet with the airline's senior leadership team, to discuss the changes in person, and to provide his input on how the airline could continue to improve. He agreed, though part of him was still in disbelief. A major company was actually asking for his opinion, taking his experience seriously. As the meeting approached, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here. He had been just another passenger on a flight, doing his best to get home after a long deployment. But in the span of a few weeks, he had gone from feeling disrespected and dismissed to becoming a voice for change within a major corporation. It was an unexpected outcome, but it was one that had taken determination, persistence, and a willingness to stand up when it mattered. On the day of the meeting, James dressed in his uniform, the weight of his military experience settling on his shoulders as he walked into the airline's corporate headquarters. He was met by a small group of executives, all eager to hear his thoughts. They apologized again for the incident, but this time their words felt genuine. They weren't just checking off a box. They were listening. They were asking questions, taking notes, and showing a willingness to understand what had gone wrong. James spent the next few hours talking with them, sharing his experience in detail and offering suggestions on how they could ensure that this didn't happen again. He told them about the importance of respect, about how small gestures could make a big difference, about how an airline could show its appreciation for military members without it feeling like a token gesture. He told them that they needed to do more than just apologize. They needed to make military appreciation part of their company culture, something that was embedded in everything they did, from training to customer service. By the end of the meeting, James felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't expected. The executives were genuinely interested in making changes. They asked for his continued involvement, and James agreed to help them stay on track, to make sure that the commitments they had made would be more than just words on paper. He didn't want to just be a part of the story. He wanted to ensure the story was still being written in a way that would matter for years to come. When James left the headquarters that day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It had been a long road, filled with frustration and doubt, but in the end, he had made a difference. The company had listened, and they were taking action. But more importantly, he had learned something about himself. He had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right takes more than just speaking out. It takes persistence, patience, and the courage to push through even when the odds seem stacked against you. James had started this journey hoping to get a resolution for himself, but in the end, he had helped create something much bigger. He had helped set a new standard, one where respect was no longer optional, and where everyone, no matter their background, could count on being treated with dignity. And that, he knew, was a victory worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed his meeting with the airline's senior leadership, James couldn't help but reflect on just how much his life had changed since that fateful flight. What had started as a simple, and in many ways unsettling experience, had spiraled into something far larger than he could have imagined. What he had thought would be a short-lived battle over a first-class seat had turned into a full-blown campaign for change, not only within the airline but also within the broader context of how military personnel are treated by companies and the public at large. James had spent years in the military, understanding the power of discipline, order, and respect. But he had never really thought about how that respect should translate into the world beyond the military, especially in civilian spaces like airlines, hotels, or retail businesses. The incident had opened his eyes to a deeper issue that many soldiers faced but rarely talked about: the subtle forms of disrespect that went unnoticed by most people. It wasn't always about major incidents, like being turned away at the gate or denied service, but about the small, insidious moments that made service members feel less than, as if they were somehow undeserving of the respect they were supposed to be entitled to. The feedback he received from the airline after the meeting, the tangible actions they were taking, were more than just a personal victory. They were proof that change was possible when people were willing to stand up and demand it. And for James, that was enough to make him feel like he hadn't just been fighting for his own dignity. He had been fighting for the dignity of countless others who had been subjected to similar mistreatment without ever having a chance to voice their frustrations. He could feel a quiet sense of pride building inside him, knowing that his actions had sparked a ripple effect that could help change the way businesses interacted with the military community. One afternoon, a month after the resolution, he was sitting at home when he received another email from the airline. This time, it wasn't a corporate communication or an apology. It was an invitation to be part of a focus group they were organizing. They wanted James to help shape the future of their military appreciation policies. It was clear from the invitation that they had made the changes he had requested, but now they wanted his input on how to make the experience even better for military travelers moving forward. It wasn't just lip service. The airline was actively asking for his advice, showing a commitment to make real, lasting changes. The group meeting was set for a few weeks later, and James had mixed feelings about it. He appreciated the gesture, but part of him wondered if it was just another way for the airline to tick a box. However, he also understood that real change often took time, and the fact that they were still reaching out for feedback meant that they were at least serious about improving. When the day of the focus group arrived, James found himself in a conference room with several other military veterans. They came from different branches, backgrounds, and areas of service, but all shared one common experience. They had been treated unfairly at some point during their travels. Some had been denied upgrades, others had been overlooked by customer service staff, and many had been subjected to subtle biases or stereotypes. James listened closely as they shared their stories. It was striking how many of their experiences mirrored his own. Instances of being treated like an afterthought, dismissed, or even ignored. The focus group was more than just a meeting. It became a cathartic experience for everyone involved. For James, it was a chance to realize just how much of a collective issue this really was. The mistreatment wasn't just one isolated event. It was part of a pattern that had affected military members in different ways over time. Hearing the other veterans speak about their own experiences made him feel less isolated. It wasn't just about one person speaking up. It was about a community coming together to demand the respect they deserved. The meeting lasted for several hours, and by the end of it, James felt a sense of hope he hadn't expected. The airline executives present took notes furiously, asking questions, offering explanations, and even admitting that they had never fully understood the depth of the issues faced by military personnel. They were genuinely engaged, and as the meeting wound down, they asked the group for concrete suggestions on how to improve their service. It wasn't just about giving them an apology anymore. It was about offering tangible solutions. James spoke up, suggesting that the airline create a dedicated support line for military personnel, a way for them to contact customer service quickly and directly, without having to explain their situation repeatedly. He also recommended that the airline work more closely with veterans organizations to ensure their policies aligned with the needs of the military community. But the most important suggestion he made was simple: treat every soldier, every veteran, like they matter, because they do. He also emphasized that the changes needed to be reflected in the company's culture, not just in their policies. A program can only go so far, he said. It's the people who matter. When a flight attendant is walking down the aisle and sees a soldier in uniform, they should feel a sense of pride, not just duty. They should know that what they do has real meaning. The respect has to come from the top down, and it has to be felt at every level of the company. The meeting ended on a positive note, with the airline executives thanking the veterans for their time and feedback. As James walked out of the conference room, he felt something he hadn't expected: a sense of accomplishment, not for himself, but for the people who would follow him. The changes they were working on were more than just policies. They were about creating a cultural shift. It wasn't just about accommodating military personnel. It was about appreciating them for the sacrifices they had made, understanding the unique challenges they faced, and making them feel respected and valued every step of the way. Later that week, the airline made a public announcement about the new policies they had implemented. It wasn't just a press release. It was a commitment to change, backed by actions and initiatives that would be rolled out over the next few months. The airline had partnered with military organizations to launch a nationwide awareness campaign about the importance of treating military personnel with respect and dignity. They also introduced a new Veterans Priority program, offering veterans and active duty military personnel access to priority seating, early boarding, and a dedicated customer service line. For James, the campaign was the culmination of everything he had fought for. It wasn't just about one isolated incident. It was about ensuring that no soldier would ever have to feel the way he had felt on that flight again. The real change had come, not just in the airline's policies, but in the mindset of the people who worked there. They were finally starting to see military personnel, not as a special case, but as valued members of society who deserved the same respect as any other customer. As he sat back and reflected on how far things had come, James realized that the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The change they had worked for was finally happening, and that was something worth fighting for. The journey he had started with a single complaint had grown into something much bigger, and it had the potential to make a lasting difference for generations of military personnel to come. The battle had been long, but the victory was worth it, and James knew with a deep sense of satisfaction that the journey was far from over. As the months passed, the changes James had pushed for began to take root. The airline's new military appreciation program was slowly gaining traction, and while it was still a work in progress, it was clear that things were improving. Veterans and active duty personnel who traveled with the airline were starting to see the benefits firsthand. James continued to stay in touch with the airline, checking in on the progress of the initiatives, offering advice, and even participating in a few more focus groups. It was becoming clear that the company was serious about its commitment to change, and James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. The impact wasn't just confined to the airline. Other companies began to take notice of what was happening, and James found himself fielding calls and emails from businesses across various industries, asking for advice on how to improve their own policies for military personnel. It was a ripple effect that James hadn't anticipated. What had started as a single incident, one man's frustration over being treated unfairly, had transformed into a larger movement, one that called for respect, appreciation, and accountability for those who had served. James knew that change was rarely instantaneous. It took time for new policies to become fully ingrained in a company's culture. But he also knew that he had sparked something powerful, something that couldn't be easily undone. The journey hadn't been easy, and it had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but the results spoke for themselves. More airlines, more businesses, more people were starting to recognize the value of respecting military personnel. It wasn't just about making an occasional gesture. It was about building a culture of respect that would last for generations. And the most satisfying part? The thousands of military personnel who would benefit from the changes. James could already hear the stories of soldiers, veterans, and their families traveling more easily, feeling respected, and knowing that their service was appreciated in a way it never had been before. The small victories were adding up. It wasn't just the large companies or the high-profile programs. It was the little things. A soldier walking into an airport and being greeted with respect. A veteran getting an upgraded seat without having to ask. A family traveling together, not feeling like they had to fight for basic amenities. These were the things James had fought for, and now they were becoming a reality. For James, the work was never truly finished. There was always more to be done, more ways to improve, and more people to reach. But the feeling of progress was undeniable. He had seen the airline change, seen the way they viewed their responsibility to military personnel shift. And he knew that, even if he wasn't always at the forefront of the movement, his impact would be felt for a long time. Every time James walked through an airport or boarded a flight, he noticed the small changes. flight attendants greeting military personnel with more respect, the subtle but noticeable difference in the way people interacted with soldiers in uniform. It was a quiet shift, but it was one that made all the difference. As he stood at the gate for another flight one day, James looked around at the other passengers, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This wasn't the world he had grown up in, where soldiers like him were often overlooked or ignored. It was a world where respect was the baseline, where companies like this airline were finally recognizing the sacrifices made by those who served. And that, to him, was a victory. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a catalyst for change. A person who had seen a problem, fought for it, and, in the end, helped make the world a little bit better. And that feeling of having made a difference was something that would stay with him long after the story had faded from the headlines. The days after the resolution were quieter, more reflective. James returned to his routine, to the work and life that had defined him before this incident had sparked such a dramatic chain of events. But now, there was a sense of purpose that had been added to his day.